It was an early Tuesday morning in downtown Chicago, the city just beginning to wake up. The streets were filled with people hurrying to work, the typical weekday hustle of commuters in suits, others in gym clothes from an early workout, all of them weaving around the massive city blocks, clutching coffee cups in their hands. I had just finished an early meeting with a client and stopped by my usual haunt, a cozy coffee shop that had become a part of my daily routine. It had an old-school charm, the kind of place where people didn't mind sitting down for hours with their laptops or journals. The barista knew my order without asking, and the soft hum of conversation made it the perfect spot to get some quiet time. The warm scent of brewed coffee mixed with freshly baked pastries always calmed my mind. On this particular morning, the coffee shop was busier than usual. The young professionals were here early today, likely gearing up for a busy workday. I found my usual seat by the window, a small round table near the corner that offered a perfect view of the street outside. The place was full of the typical morning energy, people typing away on laptops, reading the paper, or chatting with colleagues. A group of guys in their late 20s or early 30s were sitting at the table directly across from me, their voices rising above the usual cafe murmur. They were talking about their startup, or rather, their big idea, the one that they believed was going to make them rich and change the world. From what I overheard, they were working on an app that they believed would revolutionize personal finance. They were already pitching it to investors, boasting about how it was the next big thing. The names they dropped, top Silicon Valley firms, tech giants, sounded impressive, though I had my doubts. The startup world was full of big dreams, often punctuated by bigger failures. These guys seemed confident, almost to the point of arrogance. I didn't mind. It wasn't my first time hearing such conversations in this coffee shop. In a city like Chicago, ambition ran as deep as the deep dish pizza. People came here with ideas, dreams, and plans. But what struck me as odd was the way these young guys were talking about others. They weren't speaking badly about just any competitors or other startups. No, they were making fun of an older man who had been sitting in the same corner of the coffee shop for the past hour. I hadn't paid much attention to him at first. He was an elderly man, probably in his early 70s. His clothes were old-fashioned, a thick wool coat, a knit cap, and scuffed-up shoes that seemed to have seen better days. He was sitting by himself, sipping his coffee slowly, a quiet presence in the midst of the bustling room. But the guys across from me had clearly noticed him, and they couldn't resist the urge to make some pointed comments. They were laughing amongst themselves, leaning in a little too much as they exchanged snarky remarks. "Look at him," one of the guys, Ethan, said, shaking his head as if the old man was some kind of oddity. "What's he even doing here? What's he, some retired guy who doesn't know how to use a smartphone? I bet he's got no idea what a startup even is." The others chuckled, though I could tell their amusement wasn't entirely friendly. Ethan, the leader of the group, leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the attention he was getting from his friends. "I bet he doesn't even know how to open an email, let alone make a business plan," he added loudly enough that the older man could hear, though he was too absorbed in his own thoughts to respond. The other guys snickered and agreed. "Probably doesn't even know what Wi-Fi is," another added. I watched the old man closely. He hadn't reacted, hadn't even acknowledged the comments. His gaze remained steady, his expression calm and unbothered. I expected him to either get up and leave or, at the very least, show some sign of discomfort. But he didn't. He simply sipped his coffee slowly and looked out the window. Meanwhile, the young men continued their conversation, louder now, as if trying to prove how much better they were than the old man, who sat in his corner, minding his business. I thought about saying something. It wasn't right to mock someone like that, especially someone who wasn't even responding, but instead, I stayed quiet. It wasn't my place to intervene in their little game, especially when it seemed so harmless, at least at the time. Eventually, the group of young men gathered their things, preparing to leave. Ethan, the one who had been the loudest, stood up, stretched, and walked over to the older man's table. "Hey, old man," Ethan said, the smirk never leaving his face. "You know, this place is for people who actually get what's going on in the world. Maybe you should find somewhere else to sit. This is a place for people with real ideas." I wasn't sure if the old man even heard him. He didn't look up at first, didn't acknowledge Ethan's words. Then, after a brief pause, he slowly lifted his head, making eye contact with Ethan for the first time. "I see," the old man said softly, with a slight smile. "Well, I'm not in your way, and I don't plan to be." Ethan, sensing no confrontation, was momentarily speechless. After a beat, he scoffed, shrugged, and walked out of the shop with his friends, laughing. The rest of the morning passed uneventfully. The cafe continued to buzz with energy, and I went about my business. I couldn't stop thinking about that moment, though. The older man's calm response, the way he held himself even when provoked. I'd expected him to say something more, something sharp. But no, he'd chosen to simply rise above it. A week later, I was back at the same coffee shop. This time, the place was less crowded, and I was sitting near the same window reading through emails. Ethan, the same guy from the week before, was sitting outside with a phone to his ear. He looked frazzled, stressed, and there was no sign of the smug confidence he'd had the week before. I could hear snippets of his conversation as he paced. "Yeah, I didn't realize who he was at first, and now, I don't know, he's the CEO of that huge firm, the one that's been funding all those startups, the one we've been trying to get into." I froze. CEO? The man from the coffee shop? The one Ethan had mocked? The conversation continued, but my thoughts were racing. "Yeah, his name's Richard Hayward. He's a major player in the industry. He's been in business for decades, quietly investing in companies, building his portfolio." I couldn't believe it. The man they'd mocked so openly was a well-respected businessman, an investor with a fortune to match. Not just any random old guy, but someone who could change the course of their future with just a single decision. Ethan tracked down the older man a few days after that, making an apology call and requesting a meeting. To his surprise, Richard Hayward, the CEO, agreed. When they finally met, Ethan had a chance to apologize in person, and this time he wasn't just trying to impress anyone. He was genuinely sorry, having realized how dismissive and arrogant he'd been. Richard, the businessman, had responded with the kind of patience you'd expect from someone who had seen it all, someone who understood that success didn't come from tearing others down, but from giving them a chance. "I wasn't offended by your words, son," Richard had said, "but I hope you've learned that a little respect goes a long way in this world." Months later, I ran into Ethan at the same coffee shop. His attitude had shifted noticeably. Gone was the cocky bravado, replaced with a more measured approach to his business and life. He'd learned his lesson the hard way. And as for Richard Hayward, I later found out that he did, in fact, invest in Ethan's startup. But money wasn't the most important thing. The real value came from the lesson Ethan learned that day, the one about respect, humility, and the unexpected encounters that change your life. As I passed by the coffee shop again, I couldn't help but think how sometimes it takes a moment of complete humility to open your eyes to the bigger picture.